Bonjour.
Bonjour. Donc, je pense qu'on est au complet.
Bonjour Saïd.
Bonjour. Salut
Comment
Mohamed.
vas-tu? C'est un plaisir de
Ça
te
va, alhamdoulilah,
revoir.
ça va.
Ça fait longtemps, hein?
Oui.
Ok. On est aussi en live sur Facebook. Donc, le live va démarrer. We're just waiting for a couple of people more to join. And then we will begin. I think our panelists are ready. And we are also very pleased and excited about this webinar. So I'd like to point out that this Zoom session is, if you don't mind, it's recorded. And we are live also on Facebook. So shall we start, Mr. Sujanesi? Okay. So hello and welcome to today's webinar co-organized by the EuroMed Business School and the Research Institute for European, Mediterranean and African Studies, a think tank of the EuroMed University Office. I am Hafsa El-Bekri, Professor of International Economics here at EuroMed Business School, and I'll be the moderator today. So wherever you are in the world, I hope you are happy and safe in these extraordinary times. And I'd like to thank you for joining us. Can regional economic agreements constitute the backbone of fair and more inclusive multilateral governance? Is the question we will be addressing today with our prestigious panelists. And before to present our brilliant panelists, I'd like to recall briefly the context, background, and also the purposes of this webinar. Actually, the COVID-19 pandemic was a fantastic reminder for all of us that the most critical challenges can only be dealt with coordinated action. For instance, the search for a vaccine was a collaborative and shared work of scientists around the world. And actually, this crisis reminds us that shared problems, needs, and call and demand a shared solution. That's the need for new, fair, and inclusive multilateralism is increasingly alarmed, particularly on the economic side. And I think that no one can deny that the economic multilateralism is experiencing a real challenge. And actually, it's not only because of the upheavals within the world, I mean the COVID-19, but also there are many other factors already fostering this debate on renewing multilateralism, especially the proliferation of regional trade agreements, the development of South-South economic relations, and also the pandemic management, especially the COVID-19 vaccine distribution. So to discuss this topic, we are very pleased to welcome our renowned experts, economic actors, and policymakers. And on behalf of our organizing committee, I'd like to thank Mrs. Karima Bounemra bin Sultan, Director of the African Institute for Economic Development and Planning of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Also, Mr. Said Lashimi, Chancellor External Relations at the World Trade Organization, and to whom I'd like to express gratitude for his support for this event. Mr. Ignacio Bercero, Director at the DG Trade of the European Commission. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Mr. Mohamed Ben Jelloun, Head of International Trade Relations Department at the Moroccan Ministry of Industry, Trade, Digital and Green Economy. Also, it was intended that Mrs. Maria Rosa Lunati, Senior Advisor at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, that she was planned for this webinar, but at last minute, she was unable to join us. And of course, last but not least, I'm pleased to welcome Mr. Sujanesi former ambassador, to whom I will give the floor to recall the context and to present the host organization, the Riemas. Then this would be, of course, followed by an initial round of introductory discussion with approximately 7 minutes to our panelists. And then we would have a second hour to react on the ideas that we will raise by your various interventions. And also we will have a QA session to interact with the audience. So the floor is yours, Mr. Sujin, to present the keynotes. Please.
Thank you, Professor Bekri, and good afternoon, everybody, speakers, participants. I'm very, very happy to be here with so many distinguished speakers and familiar and friendly faces. And I'm very happy to be sharing with you a couple of thoughts that may introduce the topic of this afternoon's discussion. First, I would like to say that it is really a very timely topic, a very timely moment to discuss the theme that we will be discussing. As Professor Bekri mentioned, the pandemic has led to the emergence of new international context, which is characterized by three main dimensions. The first one is that it's an economic shock, a socio-economic shock on budgets, on public spendings, on public deficits, on all deficits, trade deficits, trade and investment deficits. It's also a social shock with unemployment on the rise and a further pressure on SMEs, and this is across the globe. The second characteristic is that this pandemic context leads to new thinking about the global value chains, and there is an emergence of new concepts, well, maybe not new concepts, but concepts that are strengthening their relevance in the strategies today, concepts such as nearshoring and reshoring, and I think that this will be also a crucial dimension in the years to come. And the third characteristic is that the pandemic did not actually create the emergence of, but it accelerated the trends of big and global transitions such as the green transition, the digital transition, and also the importance of the notion of inclusive growth. Now, these three concepts were already there in the strategies and the literature and the thinking before, but the pandemic made it even stronger and more urgent to actually accelerate the pace of these these transformative trends towards the green, digital, and more inclusive economies. So within this framework, I would like just to share with you very quickly three main ideas that I'm sure we will be discussing. The first one is that multilateralism is more important than ever. We have now a favorable environment for that, with the newly elected Director General of the WTO, and we wish her the best of successes for all the reasons and all the symbolic that she embodies. Also because it's a very important moment for the reform of the institution. Our colleague Saïd Hashimi will certainly be mentioning it. Reforms on the governance of the global multilateral framework, but also issues, very crucial issues, such as the dispute settlement dimension, the e-commerce, and the intellectual property rights. The intellectual property rights have never been so important with all the vaccine issues and the present context. But in addition to this, the WTO and the global multilateral framework is also very important in order to enhance development and to promote South-South cooperation. So this also is a very major dimension. And this South-South cooperation is a subject on which, thanks to His Majesty King Mohammed VI, Morocco has shown leadership and tangible results with investments and project development throughout the continent. The second dimension that I wanted to touch upon is that trade matters can no longer be seen without a connection to investment and production. There is clearly a connection, and this connection is made all the more obvious and relevant with the discussion and the debates about the evolving value chains. The business enabling environment is important in order to increase the capacity to develop trade and investment, both from the side of the enabling issue, but also from the obstacle one. So trade and investment go hand in hand, and I think that this also falls within the new global trends of the new thinking. The third and final comment, or the third and final dimension that I would like to mention, is the connection of these first two with the regional agreements. Now, the regional agreements clearly appear today as not being, obviously, neither in contradiction or substitution to multilateralism, but rather very much the opposite. They appear as accelerators to international trade. The stronger, and all the statistics show it, the stronger a country is within its regional environment, the stronger it is in international trade. So this connection to strengthening regional and sub-regional trade and investment is certainly very important. And it is certainly important for a country like Morocco, speaking from the country in which I am speaking of today, which is currently exploring with the EU, Ignacio will be certainly mentioning it, new horizons of trade and investment partnerships. But today, this very strong relation between the EU and Morocco, a strategic relation between Morocco and the EU, let me just remind that the EU represents for Morocco 66% of its total exports, 54% of total imports, 73% of total FDIs, 71% of total tourism receipts, and 70% of the remittances from the Moroccans living abroad. This just highlights the importance, the strategic importance of the EU-Morocco relation. But this EU-Morocco relation itself falls within a larger regional vision and scope that encompasses the Euro-Med dimension, the Euro-Mediterranean dimension. We see it very clearly with the new needed thinking on the rules of origin, the African dimension as well, with the entry into force of the African Continental Free Trade Area in January 2021, and this also opens new scopes of potential opportunities, and of course the global competition, because as regional cooperation evolves, of course, it falls within a global competition, and one has to see the different dimensions of it. So we need also, within this regional dimension, these regional agreements, to make sure that we look at trade and investment with an interconnected perspective with the main transitions that I was talking about earlier. Let me remind them: the green recovery, the digitalization, and the inclusive growth. Now, the green recovery, let me just mention that we have done some work with the European Climate Foundation that shows very clearly the connection between green recovery in Africa and the benefits for inclusive growth. The digitalization also, we have a lot of initiatives that are taking place within the framework of the FES Euro-Med University and other stakeholders in Morocco that shows how stronger the connections can be with actual stakeholders on the ground, linking and developing initiatives for further digitalization. And of course, all the business environment. Next week, there will be a very important business summit organized by the OECD about the MENA region, and that also shows how important the business environment is for the promotion of trade and investment. All in all, this is just a conclusion to mention the connection between trade and investment and main dimension. So it's like a matricial perspective in which you see things from both perspectives, the horizontal and the vertical. And this is exactly what the new development model in Morocco that has been launched some time ago by His Majesty, that will open a new chapter that will allow the country, Morocco, to play fully its role in strengthening in the strengthening of the reform activities of the WTO and the regional architecture in its Euro-Mediterranean African region. Thank you, Professor Bekri, for this.
Thank you, Mr. Sejemasi, for your talk. I think that the multilateralism and the multilateral governance is an issue that we will be talking about today. And as you said, the international community has high hopes with the renewal of the American administration, but also with the appointment of Mrs. Iweala as head of the WTO. And today we have the representative of this organization, Mr. Said Hashimi. Mr. Hashimi, considering you recognize the expert at the WTO, could we say that the multilateralism is in crisis today, or in other words, what are the background elements that show that the linkage between multilateralism and regionalism is questioned under the current crisis, but also besides the current crisis? Do you think that the regional institutional practices are likely to revitalize the multilateralism governance? Which linkage could we do between the regionalism and multilateralism to bring new life, to make multilateralism fairer and more inclusive?
Thank you, Dr. Bekri. Do you hear me okay? Thank you very much. These are really pertinent questions, but I would like to start by thanking the UNIMED University, the UNIMED Business School, and Riemas, and my old friend Talha Sijilmasi to have made this meeting possible. I'm extremely honored to be among distinguished speakers and to speak about a subject that is really dear to my heart, which is the linkages that can exist between these Mediterranean and African, EU-Mediterranean and African relationship that's really key for the future. And I think where my country, Morocco, has a pivotal role to play. Furthermore, with the current crisis, which is acting as an accelerator on different fronts, I think there are, as many people say, this crisis is too good to waste. So we need to put it into practice to focus, maybe refocus on what can be done within this relationship. I will make probably 3 points, and through that maybe try to answer very quickly to some of your questions, and I'll probably leave some time also because I want to hear the other panelists, which are quite interesting, and revert back to the discussion. So my first point would be about this debate on regionalism and multilateralism, and I'll tell you upfront, I share a lot of what Talha just said. It's more into complementarity rather than conflict. I think it's a sterile kind of a discussion. So I'll talk about those complementarities. My second point would be on what the WTO could do and should do now, given the circumstances and the changes that have occurred. And my third and last point, and I think in every discussion I've been to 2 this morning, you cannot escape it, is what the WTO could do within the COVID-19 context. That's a point I think you cannot escape into your talking points these days. It has to be there. My first point on the complementarity between the regionalism and multilateralism, and I think it's quite an old debate. And in the WTO, maybe many of you would probably remember already in 2011, we had a main publication that was speaking about that debate going from coexistence to complementarity, or to coherence even. And I think we're back into that debate. And if you look to that debate in an historical context, we've gone through a certain phase where economic agreements in regional economic agreements were about trade preferences, mainly tariff preferences. So we passed that, and we went into another period, which is, I think, finishing now, which is about deeper integration, where you have those behind the border kind of agreements. You have regulation approximation between many partners, and I think that also that period is over. What we are seeing now, at least in many members of the WTO, is a new era where political leaders, trade policy leaders, are trying to reconcile two main things. You have a very tough domestic agenda on trade. Some will call it nationalistic, protectionist, etc. But you need to manage that domestic agenda with its interaction with the international trade agenda, and what to do. Organizations like the WTO, what the WTO should be doing. And I think I would be extremely interested in hearing from Ignacio, because I think he was behind some of the key EU papers that were out on EU trade policy for the next years, and the transatlantic relationship also with the United States. But also that document has a very strong annex on WTO reform, which I read with a lot of interest. And I think it would be also interesting for our debate to go into some of the things that the EU come up to manage that period I was talking about, which is about how to manage your domestic agenda with the international agenda, something called open strategic autonomy, which might sound some esoteric for some people, but I think Ignacio is here, so he's the right man to explain that to us. So that would be, I think, one interesting development that is occurring now, and it has an impact on how the WTO could react, what the WTO could do. So my bottom line is complementarity. It has always been. Many things that were developed in a regional context have made it to the WTO, advanced the WTO. There are even voices now that are speaking about, again, multilateralizing regionalism. So things that are in these agreements should make it to the WTO. So that's an interesting point, which leads me to my second point, which is what the WTO could do. And I think three main points that WTO should do, and I'll go through them. One is restore the multilateral trading system. I think it's key for the WTO itself, for its members, but also for regional trade agreements. The second thing is deliver results, long-awaited results. Second point, second thing that the WTO could do. And thirdly, and I think it's also key, is to restore the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. And there's a fourth point, but I'll come to that later in my intervention. Restoring the WTO as the go-to place for multilateral trade rules is a key endeavor, and I think many of you have mentioned Dr. Ngozi as a very welcome development. There are also now the nomination of the United States Trade Representative, Catherine Tai. She's now up and running, and she's I think has a lot of ideas, had made contacts already with a lot of, including my boss, Dr. Ngozi. Third point is there are ideas on the table for restoring the WTO. The US, the EU have both put trade, papers on what they think the trade policies, the trade rules should be, and how the WTO could advance, and that's an interesting development. Second, for the WTO role in this, it should deliver results. As you know, or many of you know, we have a ministerial conference coming up end of this year. I think it's a key moment for the system. to make itself useful for the international trade policy. We have some key negotiations going on, but I think, as my boss has been saying, the objective should be to focus on 1 or 2 areas, or maybe 3 areas. For example, fisheries subsidies, deliver results by the ministerial in November, but have also strong working plans for the next one, which is in 2023, MC30. So I think that's the kind of business-like objective that many have to work on. But I think here, again, comes the interaction with regional agreements, because in some of the issues where we don't have rules in the WTO, like for electronic commerce or investment or competition, and the list can be very long, there are a lot of advances on all these issues within a lot of regional trade agreements. So you need to see how this would play out. In the WTO context now, you have a group of members who are taking the lead because they are like-minded and they are advancing in the negotiations on some of these issues. We need by maybe MC12 in November to find a modus operandi for the whole membership to understand what to expect from this, how to go about it. So that's, I think, quite an interesting debate and the outcome that could be delivered. Restoring the WTO dispute settlement is key, because it's a pivotal importance to have a dispute settlement alongside rules. If you don't have that, then it diminishes the value of whatever you negotiate. So you need to have at least the machine as it is today working again, but maybe in parallel negotiate how we see the dispute settlement of the future, because the differences are quite large. Maybe it will take time, but I think one of the urgency is to have that judges coming back to look into the cases in the WTO. I think it's quite important. The political energy for this, when you link it to the efforts for WTO reform, because I think everything is quite linked, is there, because the EU, the US have spoken about this. The G20 has an initiative under the chairmanship of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on WTO reform. There's an initiative for that. So the political energy is there. What we could do is try to push a little bit more. There are subjects, and then maybe Ignacio will speak about this, because this is one of the key elements that will determine how the interaction between what you do regionally and multilaterally is important. It is the relationship that EU, US, and have vis-a-vis China, for example, on some subjects like industrial subsidies or technology transfer, and the debate whether that debate should be also, or the WTO should present itself as the forum for that debate. That's also a discussion worth having, whether we stay in a regional or go into a more multilateral type of discussion. Probably in a few years from now, it's not something that can be done very, very easily. Similarly, you have that debate when you have sustainability, for example, how to deal with the environment, climate change, etc. That also is something where, for example, regional agreements are most advanced, but you need to know how to make that debate into a multilateral context. I always say, the WTO, whenever we say, why would we dare go to the WTO? What's the purpose? And I think it's down to earth. It's about economies of scale. You negotiate in one go with 164 members, and you have rules with 164 members. If you're a business person, that's your key takeaway, economy of scale. I don't want to take too much time. Maybe my last point, and I'll stop there. Maybe I'll come back in the discussion, is about the COVID situation. I think a lot of people are watching, are seeing all this drama about the waiver, etc., etc. And I think I would again the energy that Dr. Ngozi is putting into that debate, and the third way, so to speak, I think it's very important to separate two important things. There is the waiver is the common WTO game legal battle that we lawyers like, but it takes years to finish. I think it should be separated from probably what Dr. Ngozi was speaking about, which is how to get the vaccines the quicker possible to everybody that needs them around the world, because everybody needs to be vaccinated to be able to have a world economy that is back. So I think we need to separate the legal battle from some sort of production agreements, or what some people say, fill and finish production facilities in some regional hubs, for example, in Africa. We could imagine that's up for discussion. Maybe that can be set up in Morocco, in Senegal, Nigeria, Ghana, but it's fill and finish. It's not that legal battle that can take longer in terms of waiver to the intellectual property rights. I think she's probably extremely right in separating the two, because it's the battle against the COVID-19 needs to be won over the next months, not the next years. And let me stop here and probably come back to maybe questions in the debate later on. Thanks very much for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Hashimi, for your intervention. I think actually it's not a dichotomous relation between regionalism and multilateralism. And as you've stated, many experts consider that the global market could also be built with the bottom-up approach. I mean, that the multilateral can and may draw many lessons from the regional institutions and experiences. And we can also consider that regional communities or areas as an institutional laboratories with limited number of actors, and of course with convergent interests. So I just want to recall that we've reached 100 participants, attendees on our Zoom session. And I would like to thank our media partner, Challenge Group, for being here with us. I want also to make link with what Mr. Hashimi have said, and with us we have Mr. Bercero, who is the director of the European Commission of Commission DG for Trade. And we know that trade is one of the EU's most powerful tools for regional integration. Mr. Bercero, we've seen recently that you have presented the European Union's new trade policy agenda, and you talked about the EU. In this new agenda, you emphasize the need for the EU to shape global rules for more sustainable and fairer globalization, and you've identified many critical areas of focus, including the WTO reform, promoting sustainable value chains, fostering regulatory cooperation, and strengthening relations with partner countries. And would like to have an overview about these critical areas of focus, and especially the last point, according to partner countries, particularly the prospects for Euro-Med-Africa relations, and also at the commercial side. How do you see the prospects of these relations, and also the linkage with multilateralism?
Well, thank you very much. And let me start by saying that it's a huge pleasure to be able to participate in this discussion in the University of Fez. A bit sorry that it's not possible to do it physically. It would be wonderful to be able to have this event in person and meet a lot of friends. I have been working for many years in my professional career. Now, it's going to be a bit difficult to tackle all the issues that you have raised in 7 minutes, I would like to start by saying a few words about the new European Union trade policy strategy, then go into the multilateral, then the regional, and finally the bilateral dimension of our relationship with Morocco. Now, we decided in the European Commission and in the European Union that was a very important moment to try to discuss and to reflect what our trade policy should be doing in the next 10 years. Because the last 4 years have been years of high turbulence, of a very deep impact in the functioning of the global trading system. And the years ahead of us are also going to be very challenging. A reference has been made to the geopolitical conflict between the United States and China and how the impacts on the global trading system. Reference has also been made to the very first to the need to recover from the pandemic and to ensure that there is an equitable economic recovery, but also at the same time to manage a fundamental transformation of our economies as we are moving in the direction of climate neutrality and with all the implications of the digital transition. All of those issues are issues that need to be factored in, to which trade policy needs to be responsive. And if you want me to summarize, we are basically identifying 3 fundamental objectives for our trade policy. First, trade policy has to be contributing towards economic recovery, but also towards the objectives of climate neutrality and the digital transformation of the European and the global economy. So you are going to be seeing a much closer interaction between trade policy and our economic policies geared towards the climate and the digital transition. Secondly, we have been experiencing an extremely difficult time for the global trading system, a very serious crisis for the World Trade Organization. And that's why we are strongly committed, and we consider to be our first trade policy priority, to work with other countries to try to ensure that we can reform the WTO so that it provides a fundamental function of establishing the rule basis on which all trade relationships need to be based. And that's the reason why we consider that WTO reform is for us at this point in time the central trade policy challenge for the European Union. It's not something that clearly we can do on our own. It has to be part of a policy of alliances, of working with countries to see how we can move this agenda forward. Certainly, we have been very, very active over the last 15 years in terms of negotiating the free trade agreements. We have developed a very broad network of free trade agreements. And of course, there are going to be opportunities out there, but a lot of our focus is going to be more now on the implementation and enforcement of the agreements that we have, with one important exception. If you actually look into the trade policy strategy and you look into what we identify as being, from the geographical point of view, our fundamental priority, there we refer to the need to strengthen our partnership with Africa and our partnership with the countries in the neighborhood, both the European neighborhood and the Southern neighborhood. So it's going to be a big effort over the next few years to see also how we can strengthen this partnership with the African continent and with countries like Morocco, which have a very close interaction with the European Union. So that, if you want, is the global picture. Let me now say a few more words on the multilateral agenda. Now, we have presented at the same time that we issued this paper, a document where we lay out our vision about WTO reform. We consider that it is critical in the next few years to put the WTO back on track. This would imply to make it possible to use the WTO also to modernize the rule book. And that is going to require more flexibility in the negotiating function in the WTO. It's going to require to find ways for the WTO to accommodate open plurilateral agreements. And we note that Morocco is actually participating actively in some of these plurilateral negotiations within the WTO framework. If we fail to introduce this flexibility, quite frankly, we fear that the attention will move elsewhere and that then countries will progressively move towards those issues, tackling them outside the framework of the WTO. We needed to see how to restore a functioning dispute settlement system. This is vital for the credibility of the WTO as an institution. We are looking forward to the opportunity to engage with the new US administration, but we expect that this is going to be a discussion that will take some time, and it will require a real effort to see how we can bring back a system which is functioning with an independent appellate body, because we cannot imagine a functioning system without an independent appellate body, but there will have to be important changes to be introduced in the way that the system actually works. And also, very fundamentally, we need to see how the function of the WTO in terms of monitoring, in terms of forum for policy discussion is reinforced, which really implies answering to the fundamental question, what is the sense of purpose of the WTO? How we can be sure that the WTO as an institution provides a useful service for all of its members. And in a way, this is the discussion about what is the articulation between the WTO and sustainable development. Sustainable development in its three dimensions: is the environmental dimension, the social dimension, and development per se. So how the WTO contributes towards sustainable development is a fundamental discussion that we need to have, and which is critical to restoring a sense of purpose to the institution. And by the way, we know that this is a point that is very much emphasized by Dr. Negosi. We think it's a wonderful opportunity to be under her leadership, to work with her to try to ensure that over the next few years we can achieve a significant a strengthening of the role of the WTO as an institution. I think we will have to go step by step. I would not enter now into the details about what can be done by NC12, but I think I would agree with what Mr. Hashimi has said. You need to be able to deliver some outcomes, particularly on issues relating to health and issues relating to the negotiation on fisheries subsidies, but you also need to set up the WTO in a very clear path towards reform through clear work programs that put the organization in the direction of a modernization of its negotiating, monitoring, and dispute settlement function. If you move from the multilateral to the regional, probably the most exciting development at the regional level is the conclusion of the African Continental Free Trade Area. That is really fundamental in terms of the perspectives of closer economic integration in the African continent. I think the economic and political significance of this development is huge, and certainly from the point of view of the European Union, we very much look forward to work together with the African Union Secretariat and with the African Union members in terms of seeing how the European Union can support this process of regional integration. And in our trade policy communication, we talk about the need to develop a real spirit of partnership, of cooperation, very much also with the objective in mind of seeing how what can be done in order to promote sustainable investment in the continent. And I think this issue of investment, I would totally agree with Ambassador Riemas. That is absolutely critical. I think as we look into the relationship between Europe and the countries in the Mediterranean, and more broadly speaking, the countries in the African continent, we need to see how we can have a closer integration of the two economies, how we can actually foster the sustainable value chains. And the critical issue from that purpose is to focus very much on investment. And if you want to focus on investment, then you also need to focus on the challenges which are linked to the climate and to the digital transition. Now, we very much are looking forward to the opportunity to see how we can deepen our relationship with Morocco. We started a few years ago to negotiate what we called, perhaps not very fortunately, a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. That's something that has not been much happening in the last few years, but we noticed that there is clearly an interest from the Moroccan side and certainly from the European side to see what can be done at this point in time to modernize our trade relationship. I think Morocco is in a strategic place in the continent, its relationship with Europe, its relationship with Africa, its capacity to attract investment. A lot is going to depend about us reflecting together what are the elements in an international trade and investment agreement that are important if you want to signal the attraction of your country as a place for sustainable investment. And I think that's the debate that we need to have between the Moroccan authorities and the European authorities. And we need to do this on the basis of identifying where it is that we have common interest to move forward. And I am optimistic. I'm optimistic that we will be able to put our negotiations on track for a much higher degree of integration. So a lot of emphasis over the next few years is going to be on working with other countries to try to ensure that we can achieve a meaningful process of reform of the WTO. We think that, to be frank, we need to be able to do the fundamental steps in that direction over the next few years. I think if we fail to put the WTO in the right track in the next few years, I think there's a very, very serious risk that the attention would move elsewhere. And I think it's good, by the way, that this is a message that Dr. Negossi is very much passing in all the meetings that he's having with ministers, that the next 3 years, MC12, MC13, are going to be critical for the WTO. We need to see how we can deepen the partnership between the African Union and the European Union. I think that we need to develop a real spirit of partnership in a trade and investment relationship. And we need to see how Morocco and the European Union, which are natural allies and which will be working together on many areas, can deepen their trade and investment relationship so that it becomes much more responsive to the needs of the digital and the green transition of our economies. So I would leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bercero, for your intervention. Actually, to follow up what was said about Mr. Lashimi, Mr. Sijumati, and what you confirm, Mr. Bercero, is that there is a clear and alarmed need and call also for making WTO back on track, but also to restart some on the regional side the regional agreements, particularly in Africa. We've seen lately that recently that also the UN Commission for Africa and especially the IDEP has been very involved in the debate and the work on how to build back better from the COVID-19, especially in Africa, how to create more sustainable, resilient and inclusive societies, and how to ensure a dynamic of trade to take strategic advantage of the landmark of the African continental free trade area. So, Mrs. Karima Bounamra Ben Sultan, the floor is yours. Please feel free to take a stance.
Thank you very much, moderator. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really delighted to see familiar faces. I have the same challenge as Ignazio, conveying a message in only 7 minutes, but in addition to the moderator being the unique female on this panel, I hope I can benefit from preferential treatment. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to zoom on the African continent to which Morocco belongs and in which Morocco is very much active in terms of trade relations, and maybe to do it through, actually we do not say building back, we say building forward. We do not want to go back. We want to really move forward and change the situation in the continent, and do it so through the African free trade area. So I'll do it in 4 points. First of all, maybe what does the AFCFTA represent today? Second, what lessons have we learned from the last 12 months? Third, the relation to WTO rapidly and in general, the multilateral system. And finally, one word about IDEP and how we can cooperate with Morocco and the partners who are around the table. So if I come back to my first point, what does AFCFTA represent today? Of course, stricto sensu, we can say that this free trade area, new one, that has been launched officially on the 1st of January of this year, is expected to be the platform that will unite 1.3 billion people, create 3.4 trillion economic bloc, boost trade within the continent itself, create jobs, and particular for the youth, and in so doing, make the demographic dividend a reality. According to ECA, estimates are that AFCFTA has the potential to boost intra-African trade by 52%, by eliminating import duties, doubling, and this can double if non-tariff barriers are also reduced. It is also one way of addressing the informal aspects and feature of the trade in Africa, and especially the engagement of women in trade in that, etc., etc. I can go on these issues, but I don't think that I can add much on what free trade area represents, except maybe giving the figures for Africa. So I'd answer the question differently. From our perspective, the AFCFTA today, more than ever, represents a lot of expectation. It is not the only the so-called normal pathway to the achievement of the Abuja Treaty. It is more seen as the last chance for the continent to cover the development gaps accumulated over the 6 decades of independences. And this is obviously the perception of the leaders. They express themselves on this, but it is increasingly becoming the expectation of the African private sector, local communities, the youth, and the women. So no justification for the FTA to fail, and it has to provide results very rapidly. This sense of urgency has been, I would say, further exacerbated by the impact of COVID pandemic. Previous speakers mentioned the COVID-19 pandemic, and this was through the exceptional measures it called for short-term solution, but also by the longer-term approaches to development in general and trade in particular that have become compulsory to rethink development in the continent and to build forward better and recover more durably. And Fatala Sijumesi earlier actually alluded to the need to think differently in the way we approach our development if we want it to be durable and equitably, and its results equitably assessed. Now, regarding COVID in particular, we know that its impact, we know what it has as impact on our economies, and we think that this impact actually is not limited in time. Given Africa's fragility, the impact is quite serious, and it will last longer maybe than in other parts of the world, and the recovery may take more time. So we really need to give ourselves the means to boost and accelerate the recovery. As I said, my second point is about the lessons that we have learned from the past 12 months to build forward better. So what are they? The first one is that more than ever, Africa needs to speak with one voice at the international level in the multilateral environment. Coming separately, countries are not heard, they have limited impact on decision, and therefore, in the context of trade, for example, we expect that the role of the AFCFTA Secretariat to be a sort of facilitator and coordinator, in addition to other institutions like the African Union Commission. We know that we are not very present at the international arena, and through this coordination mechanism, we hope that there would be a change in that. Another lesson learned is about the debt and liquidity crisis. A number of discussions have taken place, which is interesting is they have been coordinated, and ECA has led a number of discussions in the UN context, of course, as it is our natural environment, but also in cooperation with the European Union, the G7, G20, the international finance institutions, etc. And this continue to be. For example, as soon as March 2020, Minister of Finance issued a communique calling for an immediate 100 billion support to African countries. And today, Minister of the conference of ECA, the annual conference of Ministers of Finance, Planning and Economic Development of the ECA have issued a communique that will be, the first step is that they will be presented at the spring's meeting of the World Bank and the IMF, and again, talking about debt liquidity, the debt and liquidity crisis. And Fathallah Messi very rightly pointed out that what is important for trade is investment. And in this regard, there is a common position from African countries on that. Again, to speak with one voice was also something that was done for the access to medical supplies, such as masks, hydroalcoholic gel, gloves, ventilators, etc. It has also been implemented for a joint procurement process for those supplies, but today for the vaccine. And this is very important for the continent. The second aspect of the lessons is that Africa needs to build its own capacity, its productive capacity, industrialization, a more tangible, I would say, industrialization that is closer to today's reality. And you have all spoken about going digital and green, trying to support local transformation, value addition. Research and development is also a weak link in Africa, and this is to be further developed. In terms of capacity, human and institutional, to be able to support all the programs we are recommending is also a prerequisite. For example, in terms of planning processes that integrate crisis anticipation and management, risk management, insurance issues, etc., are things where capacity is to be further promoted. An additional point is that in Africa, and we know that we already have a number of sub-regional economic communities, and we have all discussed for years the weakness of the spaghetti bowl. So we do hope that the AFCFTA will not add to this confusion in the processes to be used, the legal frameworks, etc. And the main challenge with the AFCFTA is to move from declaration and posture to real action. We have a discrepancy between legal frameworks and the reality. If you look at the books of legal frameworks that have already been adopted by the REXs, this is impressive, but at the same time, moving to action is sometimes, and implementation is sometimes a real challenge. In addition to what is happening in Africa itself, Inacho mentioned what is happening with Europe. There are also a number of bilateral discussions with the US, such as Morocco. Today, Kenya is venturing in that type of discussion, the place of China, etc. And finally, in terms of capacity, I'll just say that AFCFTA has created a real momentum for the UN to work together and to look at the multi-sectoral dimension of trade, and through the UN reform, a number of UN agencies, programs and funds have supported countries look at trade in a more holistic way, and not separated from the other areas of sustainable development, as it used to be the case before. And finally, I would say that the third lesson is that AFCFTA is calling for more intra-African integration and cooperation, and confirming that there is a real need. We have seen, witnessed a rise, and Said, I think, mentioned this, a rise of protectionism all over the globe. Now with the vaccine, a sort of first come, first served behavior, we have to recognize that this is not the first time. Inward-looking attitude, le repli sur soi, have been witnessed during the 2007-2008 financial crisis. We have also seen it with the reaction to the H1N1 pandemic, where wealthy countries actually got access to vaccines and medical care far before developed countries. But this should not become the norm. And COVID is certainly not the last crisis. And it is telling us that we have to get ready globally to future shocks, in particular in relation to climate change, in addition to health. So solidarity is also a word that is recurrently being referred to in the context of the AFCFTA and the impact of COVID. And you have heard the director, the DG of WHO, say that no one will be safe until everyone is safe. So we need to work together. I mean, these are not issues where we can work in isolation. Also, the AFCFTA is the platform for more cooperative projects in sectors such as basic infrastructure, energy, ICT, development of financial instruments, fight against illicit financial flows, etc., etc. And I would like to mention that in this context, actually, in terms of information sharing and joint supply, the countries have established through the leadership of the ECA and the African Union Commission, the African Medical Supply Platform. So how will this impact Africa's relation to the WTO? Today, you know that we have 44 African countries as members of the WTO, and 9 engaged in demand for accession. We expect that through AFCFTA, the country waiting to access WTO are expected to intensify their engagement at the level of their respective representation. But this needs a number of prerequisites, I would say. The first one, and this has already been said, WTO is to reorganize itself and to restore its position as a main actor in multilateral trade development. Regarding Africa, I would say WTO also should restore trust in its ability to address African challenges and expectations in an equitable manner, so that multilateralism is not seen as acting for the benefit of just a few ones and those who already are powerful ones, but to act for the benefit of all. And maybe we will see doors to green rooms open in this regard. And as far as African countries are concerned, actually, Africa may be tempted to take some liberties with WTO procedures, given the current crisis and challenges. And even if the AFCFTA framework is very much designed based on WTO procedures, we have seen that there are current discussion on IPR. Said mentioned that if this is to be taken from the legal perspective, it may take a long time, but a number of countries in Africa are calling for the vaccine to be considered as a global public good and to try to discuss with the pharma companies to see how, we can work on this more tangibly. But this is one example out a number of them. And what would be expected from WTO, again, is to share its capacity development processes and knowledge management in a number of issues that the negotiation phase, either the one that has been completed or the coming one of AFCFTA are concerned, and to try to support the capacity of African development. So I'll finish with one word about IDEP. Some of you may know us, others may not. EDEP is a capacity development institute. It does it through training, but also through a think tank function. Because for us, capacity development is not just delivering courses, it is delivering a change in the way our decision makers in different sectors actually see their development and can impact the development through the skills we are sharing with them and we are enriching them with. So we have been working in various areas. I will just cite a few that are in relation from my point of view to our discussion. Of course, trade policies and negotiation, but gender and trade, a number of courses around the AFCFTA, especially addressed to non-governmental organizations. We are looking at diversification of the economies, industrialization, mining, but also the relation to social policies, to the achievement of the SDGs, etc., etc. I cannot give all the examples, but what I wanted to say by presenting EDEP is that I think that there is room here for more cooperation with the panelists and the people around the table to build, to build capacity of African countries intrinsically, I would say, but also to share Moroccan experience through this cooperation, because there is a lot to learn from Morocco. I was referring to Kenya entering into bilateral discussion with the United States. I think that it is something that is to be gained actually from what Morocco has already done. We have the ACP. They are very different from the negotiation the Mediterranean countries are having with the European Union. So what can we learn from what has been done in the context of the Mediterranean, etc., etc. So there are a number of issues that could provide room for more cooperation, both in training and research work. Thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you, Mrs. Bounamra. I think you've benefited from feminine special treatment for your talk, and I think it was very interesting to recall the pandemic context and to recall also the fundamental and key background elements about the intra-African integration. I think in this context and since the beginning of the pandemic, Morocco called also for reinforcing its position in global value chains or in the regional value chains, and it argued that it has a key role to play in these nearshoring strategies. And also Morocco aspires to become a hub for economic trade relations, notably between Europe and Africa, particularly at the time of the AFCFTA implementation. So how Morocco is preparing effectively for these regional transformations? Mr. Benjeloun, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I would like first to address my sincere thanks for the invitation you have extended to me to take part in this webinar. And I would like also to express my sincere congratulations to the organizers, in particular the Euro-Mediterranean University of Fez, the Euromed Business School, and the Riemas think tank for the tireless efforts made to organize an important such event on a subject which finds all its topicality. And now let me introduce my presentation in French. Avant de répondre directement à la question, permettez-moi de rappeler certains aspects liés au système commercial multilatéral et à ses missions fondamentales que sont la transparence, 2, la prévisibilité des échanges, et 3, la capacité du système à accompagner l'évolution du commerce international dans toute la complexité des pratiques. Si en matière de transparence, le système continue à jouer son rôle correctement, en revanche, en termes de prévisibilité, force est de constater que jamais durant ces 20 dernières années, le gap entre les tarifs préférentiels et les tarifs appliqués au niveau NPF n'a été aussi grand qu'actuellement. Ensuite, le nombre de mesures tarifaires sont en nette croissance. Si l'on compare par exemple les données de 2010 avec celles de 2020, le nombre de mesures notifiées à l'OMC au titre de l'accord sur les obstacles techniques au commerce était de presque 2000 en 2020, alors qu'il était de 1350 en 2009, c'est-à-dire en pleine année de crise économique et financière mondiale. Et puis, le nombre de mesures SPS a triplé en 2020 par rapport à celle de 2009. Donc, ils sont passés de 2009 de 522 à plus de 1500 en 2020. Et puis, en termes d'accompagnement du commerce international, force est de constater amèrement que le système peine à prendre des décisions depuis le lancement du cycle Doha en 2001, des décisions majeures. Nous avons vu comment toutes les discussions sur les subventions n'ont pas pu aboutir, les réductions des tarifs non plus, aussi bien agricoles que pour les produits non agricoles. Que sur le commerce électronique, on va de report en report sur le moratoire concernant la non-taxation des transactions électroniques. Et puis sur les thèmes de Singapour, à savoir la concurrence, l'investissement, les marchés publics et le quatrième, la concurrence. Le seul rescapé, si l'on peut dire, est celui de la facilitation des échanges, mais malheureusement, les bénéfices attendus de l'accord, de la mise en œuvre de l'accord sur la facilitation des échanges ont été largement inhibés ces dernières années par la montée des prix des services de transport et de logistique dus aux effets de la pandémie Covid-19. Donc, quelle réforme de l'OMC? La réforme devra s'intéresser à apporter des éléments de réponse à comment le système commercial multilatéral peut-il apporter des réponses adéquates à la relance post-Covid de manière durable et inclusive. Et je pense que les éléments de réponse au niveau multilatéral sont également valables au niveau régional et local, bien sûr, via une adaptation. La première des choses est liée à l'investissement et comme vous l'avez dit, professeur, c'est une thématique centrale. Ce que je voudrais rappeler, c'est d'abord l'expérience du Maroc à lutter contre la pandémie. Et notre expérience a démontré la capacité du Royaume à répondre de manière efficace à sa demande intérieure, voire à celle d'autres pays de la région et du continent, en produits importants pour la lutte contre la pandémie et contre l'expansion de la Covid-19, tels que les masques barrières, les respirateurs, les kits de tests, les thermomètres et caméras infrarouges, ainsi que d'autres dispositifs médicaux. Et Et pendant la pandémie, le Maroc a même inscrit son action en complémentarité avec certains partenaires européens, par exemple pour la production des masques barrières, une trentaine d'unités de production de ces masques ont travaillé conjointement avec leur homologue espagnol pour fournir l'Espagne en ces produits. Également, on travaille avec la France, l'Italie et d'autres pays européens. Et tout ça parce que la pandémie, comme vous le savez, a mis à rude épreuve les chaînes de valeur mondiales et que nous nous sommes rendus compte qu'il est essentiel de régionaliser ces chaînes de valeur et d'asseoir l'environnement adéquat pour procéder à ces réformes majeures. Donc, si l'investissement sur le plan de l'OMC constitue une des pistes importantes qui est exploitée pour la relance post-pandémique, et dans le cadre du programme de l'OMC, du programme actuel, même sur le plan régional, elle est d'une importance capitale. Le Maroc fait partie du voisinage méditerranéen qui est quand même érigé comme partenaire stratégique de l'Union européenne. Et l'Afrique subsaharienne en est le prolongement naturel de ce voisinage méditerranéen. De par son positionnement géographique et économique et commercial, le Maroc est naturellement un pont entre l'Union européenne et l'Afrique et le reste du continent africain, notamment dans sa façade atlantique et également via le passage terrestre de Guergueres qui désormais est ouvert pour renforcer et raffermir les liens commerciaux entre le Maroc et la partie ouest et du continent et jouer cette jonction avec l'Europe. Maintenant, comme vous le savez, la ZLECAf et la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine est fonctionnelle depuis le début de cette année. Certes, les derniers réglages sont encore en cours, mais il y a plus de 34 pays qui ont ratifié l'accord ZLECAf, une quarantaine d'offres sur la table, dont plusieurs sont en vigueur. Et dans l'actuelle configuration, le Maroc offre une réponse à son partenaire européen pour l'accès, pour le raccourcissement des chaînes de valeur, mais également pour l'accès à un marché africain d'1,2 milliard de consommateurs. Et grâce à la mise en place de cette zone de libre-échange qui se fera sur 5 ans, donc progressivement avec des réductions tarifaires d'ici au 1er janvier 2025 et grâce à la libéralisation de services dans 5 secteurs qui ont été identifiés comme prioritaires, à savoir les télécoms, les services financiers, les services aux entreprises, les services de transport et les services touristiques. Donc, voilà pour ce qui est de la jonction entre l'Union européenne et l'Afrique. Maintenant, il y a d'autres thématiques qui demeurent fondamentales, aussi bien sur le plan du système commercial multilatéral que régional, savoir ce qu'on appelle le verdissement, et qui est une priorité de l'Union européenne et qui est en réalité une priorité mondiale depuis la signature des accords de l'accord de Paris et le Maroc a joué quand même un rôle important dans le lancement de la mise en œuvre de cet accord et a montré ses capacités et a apporté des solutions à l'Union européenne, au moins en la matière, puisque 40% de l'énergie produite dans le royaume est d'origine renouvelable. Il y a également le sujet du numérique. C'est un sujet qui est d'une importance aussi bien sur le plan régional que sur le plan multilatéral pour réduire la fracture numérique, mais également parce que l'expérience pendant la pandémie a démontré que les pays qui s'en sont sortis le plus sont ceux qui étaient le mieux préparés pour le commerce électronique, mais également qui étaient le mieux intégrés dans leur environnement régional. Voilà pour ce qui est des éléments que je voulais apporter lors de ce premier tour.
Merci à vous, Monsieur Benjelloun. Merci pour votre intervention. So we heard Mr. Benjelloun advocating for transparency, for predictability and competitiveness in the context, of course, of the evolution of international trade, and also calling for the need for answers from the multilateral system. And also, he tried to recall the context of the reason of triangular relations between EU and Africa, and the junction between the two continents could be done through Morocco. So the main questions: integrating regional and sustainable value chains, and also strengthening the Moroccan position into the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, are the main and the crux of the matter that had been raised by Mr. Benjelloun. Thank you, Mr. Benjelloun. I'd like also to go back on a previous statement about the intra-African integration and the work of EDEP. I think that EDEP is very involved in such works, and I'd like to mention at the contrary of Mr. Sijil Massi, that here at the Riemas University of Fez, we are also involved in such works on intra-African integration, and I will briefly give you an overview of a paper I worked on with Mr. Sijil Massi about the African trade integration in the regional economic communities. And the aim of this paper was to identify the intra-African trade structures and to determine the main factors likely to intensify continental trade, particularly the role of regional economic communities. And we try to recall that economic integration combines both trade agreements and various structural factors. I mean, some proximity trade factors, like geographical distance, cultural, historical, and linguistic links, similarities in political systems, living standards, or even trade policies. Taking into consideration all these elements, we try to measure the trade affinities of two countries, mainly Morocco and South Africa, within their home regional economic communities and outside and beyond their regional economic communities. And finally, we try to explain the bilateral relative intensities by an econometric model. For that, we used 4 exogenous variables that help us to explain the intensity, I mean the relative geographic distance, the gap in specialization structures, the economic distance, the distance from living standards between African countries, and also the integration of regional economic communities. So we will be delighted to share this work with you, and maybe as we round out this first debate and close off the first round of discussions, it would be appropriate to comment on the previous interventions. I maybe start by Mr. Sigil Messi, if you have any additional comments or questions according to the previous interventions, please.
Thank you very much. And yes, indeed, Professor Bekri, what we will do is that we will send to the colleagues the two papers, the paper that we have written on EU-Africa future partnership, so the perspectives. I think you will find some interesting insights on how to connect this with the sub-regional dynamics of the economic regional communities, as Madame Sultan mentioned earlier. And second, the paper, actually your paper, Hafsa, on the regional, on the intensity, the trade intensity. And I think that everybody will find it very interesting to see what are the realities of sub-regional trade and the potential and actually the lacking potential. What should be normal and if not, and then from there you can define the different the needed things to do. What I wanted to touch upon just very briefly, listening to all the speakers and actually agreeing with all the speakers on their interventions, is the missing link here and the missing person in this virtual room is the private sector. And I think that we should engage more with the private sector. We should make sure that their involvement is really in line with the evolutions of our discussions on all the thematics that we have mentioned. And I'm sharing with you this because my feeling, and I have observed it also during the exploration that I have been doing. For example, when I wrote my book called The Future of Europe is in the South. And of course, preparing the book was a good opportunity to, to interact with a lot of stakeholders and dig a little bit more in depth into a certain number of realities. And what struck me then, what we all know, but I don't think that we know the magnitude of this reality, is how advanced the private sector is ahead of the institutions. I think they're ahead of us. And so linking with more structurally with the private sector would, I think, provide us with a lot of interesting information and tools, and of course they could also in return benefit from what we are discussing and the perspectives of it. I just wanted to mention this dimension because I believe that we should do more with the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sigil Messi. Mr. Said Hashimi, do you have any additional comments?
Well, thank you very much. I've been listening very, very carefully to what is a very passionate debate. And I agree with Ambassador Sigil Messi that the private sector is a key player in this. And I think if I don't want to take too much time, but if I limit my remarks to the COVID-19 context, I think they are also ahead of the game, including in our continent. And I think the the major motto that we should all try, because that's very, very close to my heart, is to turn this crisis into opportunity. The way some private sectors in South Africa, for example, have managed to have a deal already with Johnson & Johnson to produce the vaccines in South Africa, or for Egypt to do the same with the Russian vaccine, are really examples of what Ambassador Sijimasi was saying. So these are really, really ahead of the game. And I think if the private sector is put into that mix, things will go quite quickly, because as I said, one of the major challenges we have is that if the pace of vaccination distribution is kept as it is today, some countries will only get vaccinated in 2024, which is outrageous. The current, as Dr. Ngugi said, I think a couple of days ago, the current world production capacity is about 3.5 billion. The current need is about 11 billion. So the gap is just huge, and you need all the ones that can step in to play that game and increase that capacity. Now, I think one of the major things happening in Africa with the continental free trade area is the fact that you need also that phase of approximation, regulation, regulatory bodies to speak to each other, to do a lot of things to make these operations of fill and finish operation or licensing for production of vaccines a reality. I think that's something that is really key, and the private sector plays a role into that, because I think this is not only for COVID-19. Let's not forget, for example, that West Africa, this is the hardest hit place with malaria. They need vaccines every year. It's only there and India. So India has its own facilities to produce vaccines. We can imagine countries like Nigeria, Ghana, or Senegal that have the capacity to produce. Other countries from other regions could also do that. So it's a manageable operation that needs to be probably encouraged to be able to respond effectively to the current crisis where we are today. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mr. Rashimi. Actually, I think that it would be the first signs of a fairer multilateral system. And I will give the floor to Mr. Ignacio Bercero to give us comments or comments on the first roundtable. Mr. Bercero, could you please turn on your... Thank you.
Yes, sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. And let me start by saying that I totally agree with the two previous speakers about how critical is going to be the active engagement of the private sector in order to achieve the objectives of what we wanted to achieve in the economic recovery. It is clear that the challenge of expanding rapidly production of vaccines is only going to be possible through close cooperation between those companies that have been developing the vaccines and those companies that have the production capacity. And it's going to require a strong push, a strong establishment by the public authorities to get the companies to cooperate. And I think that's the very clear message that has been passed by Dr. Ngozi, and we very much support her endeavor to see how production capacities can be enhanced in the short term. Also think that the participation of the private sector is going to be critical for success of what we wanted to do regionally, what we wanted to do bilaterally. After all, the fundamental objective is to encourage sustainable investment, and that's only going to be possible if you actually show to the companies what it is their interest and their motivation to invest. Now, the other message which I wanted to pass is that I think the 4 next year are going to be critical for the multilateral, for the regional, and for the bilateral agenda. I mean, as far as the WTO is concerned, I think that it is going to be fundamental that we put the process of reform on track at the end of this year, so that by NC13, we can really show that we have restored a functioning dispute settlement system, that we have restored the of the WTO as a negotiating forum where rules can be developed, and that the members of the WTO have enough of a sense of common purpose about how to discuss and how to develop policies relating to sustainable development. That is going to be key, and that really needs to be achieved in the next 4 years. If we fail to achieve that in the next 4 years, I think we really risk a major fragmentation of the global trading system. I think the next 4 years are also going to be critical in the process of African economic integration. And it's going to be critical that we also establish the right relationship between the European Union and the African Union, so that the African Union sees what is the added value that Europe can bring to support your process of regional economic integration. And after many years about discussing with Morocco how to modernize our trade and investment relationship, after a few false starts, I really hope that in the next 4 years we are going to find a way forward, and I'm very happy to know that His Excellency Mr. Riemas is going to be very actively engaged in that process of trying to see how to move forward our bilateral relationship, and also I'm sure that Mr. Benjeloun will be playing a very important role in that task.
Thank you, Mr. Bercero. Thank you for your additional comments. And maybe Mrs. Bunemra, do you have any remarks?
Thank you, moderator. Thank you very much. First, thank you for your offer to share your papers with us. I look forward to receiving them. Just wanted to react to what was said about the time frame for the vaccination. And actually, there are discussions going on now for local production of vaccines in Africa. There are discussions mainly with South Africa, but other countries like Morocco, Senegal have been identified as potential manufacturer of the vaccines. But the criteria and the conditions are still very much strong, and it may take time, but these are things that are on the pipeline, and we have been discussing them through the last 3 days. So those who are interested, please visit our website. And I wanted to add a comment to what at the beginning Sidi Messi said about the need to invest, because actually, I mean, you can't trade if you don't produce. And basically, for us, at least in Africa, there is a minimum actually to do in terms of investment to enhance the productive capacity and to have competitive goods and services that are attractive both to Africans and outside Africa. So that we need to build peer-to-peer relation with other regions of the world and not just be consumers of the global environment. So, and in this context, we have a dilemma today. I mean, because of the crisis, a number of countries have faced economic struggles and issues, and the rating agencies have decreased a number of rates for countries, which means that the countries are seen as more risky and less attractive to foreign investment. Of course, we are promoting domestic revenue generation, but the level and the capacity of our private sector is still limited. Our financial system is still not as well structured as we want it to be. So these are the issues that I think we can discuss also in the context of multilateral agreements and multilateral discussion, because we depend on those ratings, and these are hurting actually the capacity of African countries to build forward better and recover rapidly. Thank you. But this is a long discussion, but I wanted to mention it because I think that it is an important issue. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Bunemra. I think this question also of private sector and investors is questioning the multilateral system, and we addressed this question in our concept notes, that how to bring to the fore the issues of investment and finance, and also competition in the multilateral system, and also in the new North-South economic agreements. So, Mr. Benjeloun, maybe you have an additional comment?
Yes, thank you. Je partage entièrement la remarque formulée par Excellence, Monsieur Sigil Messier. Le secteur privé est effectivement l'absent, mais un travail dans le sens de la mobilisation et de son information est essentiel à au moins 3 niveaux. Le premier niveau, en ce qui concerne l'information et sa sensibilisation en ce qui concerne les offres réalisées par les pays membres de la SLECAF et qui sont maintenant diffusées, de manière à pouvoir procéder à l'identification du potentiel d'affaires additionnel à la lumière de la réalité économique des pays et des produits objets de la libéralisation dans le cadre de cette zone de libre-échange. Le deuxième niveau sur le plan de l'investissement est là aussi bien pour réaliser les investissements nationaux pour exploiter les opportunités à l'export que la réalisation d'investissements dans des pays d'accueil pour renforcer l'intégration sur une base, l'intégration économique et commerciale sur une base win-win. Et là, le Maroc a un positionnement qui lui permet d'être le pont d'entrée vers l'Afrique, eu égard au progrès que j'ai évoqué tout à l'heure sur le plan énergétique, notamment, et comme hub, eu égard à sa capacité à apporter des réponses efficaces en termes d'investissement. Et puis, je voulais attirer l'attention des participants sur le fait que dans le cadre de la SLECAF, un mécanisme de notification a été mis en place pour le traitement des mesures non tarifaires qui auraient été rencontrées par les opérateurs économiques. Et il est très important que ce mécanisme soit connu des opérateurs pour pouvoir notifier les mesures non tarifaires, notamment d'ordre administratif, qu'ils rencontreraient dans l'exploitation de l'accord SLECAF, pour pouvoir traiter ces notifications et renforcer les échanges sur de bonnes bases. Et merci.
Merci à vous, Monsieur Benjeloun. Okay, I think I would like to thank again our media partner of the person of Mr. Abdelaziz Messaoudi, group Challenge Group, and also Mrs. Michaela Dodini, and all the group of the EU. I see also Mr. Van den Beek and Mrs. Zineb Skali, to whom I address my gratitude and my thanks. So thank you for joining us. I think that we can open the discussion with the audience. If you have any question, I don't see any question here in the Q&A. Okay. I think that we have the first question from a student from the EuroMed Business School. And maybe I will just read her question. Miss Zinab Duri would ask the following question. Morocco has made huge efforts to empower citizens and to strengthen human capital. Yet Morocco don't feel that their quality to life has improved, and many in fact have declined. And also, she said that Morocco exploited aggressively its geostrategic competitiveness advantage to become, through the years, a potential business and finance hub. So can Morocco become an emerging country, and how Morocco can face the lack of equitable economic growth that is paralyzing its forward progress? So I think it's a very interesting question. We have also another question of how to export to all countries in the world without any issues, or are there any countries that we can trade with? So I think that we can deal with some of these questions in the frame of geostrategic lectures with Mrs. Sliroy. So thank you for your questions. I don't see any other questions, open questions, but we are open for discussion. If you have any additional comments or remarks, we'll be happy to hear you. Mr. Sergemansi, please.
Well, first I wanted to thank the participant Imad that asked the question, and one of the things he wrote in the conversation box is, as a future entrepreneur. So I'd like to congratulate him on this future entrepreneurship, because I wanted to make the point on the importance of young people actually having the entrepreneurship feeling, intuition, and mindset. And this is, I think, one of the answers to all the questions that we have been raising, is how to encourage young people to be entrepreneurs and to face the challenges, the risk, but also the opportunities of being entrepreneurs. And everything that we have been discussing here, the agreements, the African Free Trade Agreement, the WTO, the bilateral agreement, the sub-regional agreement, these are all tools at the disposal of entrepreneurs to pick and choose on what is the best mechanism, what are the best mechanisms they can use in order to introduce themselves to new markets and to open new opportunities for investment. So that's my first reaction. As far as the first question is concerned regarding Morocco, I think, is an emerging country today because of all the dynamics. And it would be too long, and this webinar is not on that subject specifically. But let me give you just one example on how a country like Morocco is taking its assets and turning them into a competitive advantage to build new momentums in the sectors. The example is the green sector. Now, the European Union, and Ignacio Bercero mentioned it earlier, has developed a major strategy called the Green Deal, and that will be a very strong component of the future of European economics over the next decade and probably much more. Now, this Green Deal for a country like Morocco, for all the reasons that I have been mentioned earlier about the intensity of the relation between Morocco and the EU, you can either see it as an obstacle or as an opportunity. Morocco has chosen to use it as an opportunity because 10 years back, in 2009, under the initiative of His Majesty, there has been a strategy that had been launched in order to increase the capacities of the country in renewable energies, wind energies, and everything that is related to the renewable energies. That has enabled the country today to be able to envisage the partnership with the European Union, taking into consideration the Green Deal, into greening Morocco's economy as well, in order to make it a competitive advantage and not an obstacle. And this is the illustration of the emerging dimension of a country, is how do you adapt? Emerging means only adapting to evolutions, technological evolutions, socio-economic evolutions. So the emergence in the world today is actually the resilience and the adaptation capacities to be able to go hand in hand as much as possible with the evolution of the world. And I think the green tech, the green technologies are a very, very good example about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sujimati. Mr. Hashimi, please.
I thank you very much. I promise it won't be long. But I think since many students are listening to us, and this is very dear to my heart, I think we need them to keep the interests in what's going on in the World Trade Organization, for example, but what's going on in international trade in general. I think one thing we need a little bit more in Morocco is to widen the circle of knowledge about multilateral trade issues. We need people to know more. It's no longer enough to know about tariffs and the droit de douane and all these things. The most of the trade policy today is beyond that, is way, way, way beyond that. And one easy shortcut to get to that knowledge, and I'm speaking to students, is really to focus on the WTO. Today, maybe there are crises and people are questioning whether it will deliver, but don't be fooled by that. I mean, I've been in this milieu for the last 20 years. It might sound very quiet, but suddenly, because political energy comes from somewhere, everything goes up. And you need to be prepared. You need to be prepared for the rules for digital trade tomorrow. It is happening now. People are discussing those rules now. So we need to widen that circle of knowledge about these things. Participate, listen, learn. On environment, it's the same. It's the same thing. The rules we have in the WTO now are not that large, but it is. People are discussing, people are putting proposals on the table. We need people to really keep interested, widen the circle of knowledge. One third thing, dispute settlement, when it comes back, we need also to, Morocco has been an active player lately, need to invest more. So just, for the students in the Euromed University, please keep interested. It's worthwhile. There is a good return on investment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hashimi. We absolutely need to widen the circle of knowledge, as you said, and we will be very pleased to learn from the WTO and to learn with the WTO. We see a lot of programs. Let's talk trade of the WTO, for instance, and we have here at the Euromed Business School a Master of International Business. And we would be very happy and glad to have such programs with the WTO to share and to widen this circle of knowledge. Mr. Ignacio Bercero, please. Yes.
I just wanted to add a few words to the points which have just been made. First, on the WTO, I would totally agree with Mr. Hashimi. I think the WTO is going to become exciting again. Now, over the last 15 years, it's true, a lot of the activity in the trade policy world has moved into the bilateral negotiations, plurilateral negotiations. I think my sense is that we are going to see a shift of political investment, of political attention, shifting again to multilateral negotiations within the framework of the WTO, with different configurations, with different articulations. But I think that that's going to be what I would expect, that the trade policy activity is going to be developing over the next few years. And that is also going to be a challenge for the WTO in terms of how it projects its own presence better towards civil society, towards the private sector. Because one of the big issues for the WTO is how it can reconnect again towards the private sector, which is something which I think is a connection which has been lost over the last few years. Now, when it comes to Morocco, I mean, I can only very much subscribe what Ambassador Shirmaski has said. Morocco, I think, is a country which has made some clear strategic choices, which is also very ideally situated because of its relationship with Europe, because of its relationship with Africa. The potential that it has in terms of generating the investment is very big. I think what is probably still missing is finding some way to ensure that your relationship with, at least with the European Union, responds better to the reality about what are the aspirations of Morocco, because the reality is that we still have between us a very old-fashioned, I could almost say, trade and investment relationship. And I think it fits a little bit now for us to see where is the possibility of having a more modern trade and investment relationship between us. Because at the end of the day, trade agreements, more than anything, they matter because of the signals that they give, the signal that they actually give to investors. And that's what I think we need to reflect together about how we can move in that direction.
Thank you, Mr. Becerro. Yes, we retain modern trade and investment. And we have also Mrs. Bounamra who wants to add a comment. Please, Mrs.
Thank you for giving me the floor again. We all mentioned what needs to be done to regenerate, restore, relaunch WTO, and we know we all have a lot of expectation. So maybe to Morocco to say, invite them to Marrakesh, maybe there will be something happen, magic happening there. But more seriously, since we have a community of students and young people, and I'm happy that you mentioned the entrepreneurship mindset. 10 years ago, when I was director of ECA's Office of North Africa, we organized a survey with the youth, and we asked them, how do you project yourself? And more than 60% then replied, we see ourselves as civil servant, which for us was something tremendously actually dangerous. And I think that it is a mindset, and I hope that the university is also contributing to creating that mindset. This is the first point. The second point I wanted to add is there is a sector on which all our countries are dependent, and that is also a difficult one at the level of the European Union, which is the sector of agriculture. You said we need to green our economies, we need to green our agriculture, we know we need to do also digital agribusiness, etc. We mentioned green economy, there is also the blue one with countries with coastal blessing. And again, it is a sector that the youth are not tempted to venture in. And we have to also give them this perspective that there are new opportunities coming in the agriculture sector, and maybe think about how this sector can be further developed. Thank you. Over.
Thank you, Mrs. Bounamra. Actually, it is tremendously important for us at the university, Euromed University of Fez, to widen this mindset of internship, and this is one of the pillars of the university. And I think that we are well on schedule. and the need for building inclusive and more and fair multilateralism system address many questions that we will be very glad to discuss further in maybe other episodes of lectures, maybe with students, and also in webinars that we will be very pleased to organize and to share these various thematics and topics about the economic issues. Mr. Sijilmasi, would you add a final comment?
Well, first of all, I just got a message from our colleague Mohammed bin Jaloun that had to leave the room. So on his behalf, I would like to, because he's going to a meeting between the Ministry of Trade and Industry and Commissioner Varela. And my guess is that they will be speaking exactly about the same topic. So I told them just convey the message so that we can continue lobbying for that. But no, I think we have pretty much covered the main messages and the main issues. I think that we really have a good momentum in this complementarity between the visions of both the geographical and the institutional complementarities between the different visions. And I would like just to suggest to you, Professor Bekri, that we maybe initiate this as a process and that we have on and off meetings of this kind, hopefully not always behind the computers, but also in presential with the presence of each person, maybe in Marrakesh and other cities as well. But certainly, I think we have there's a good room for continued discussion. 1 hour and a half, even 2 hours are never enough to cover all the things that we would have wanted to develop and to go more in depth into the different details. But I'm just throwing into your hands that maybe it's room for thought to initiate a process that we can continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sijilmasi, and on behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to thank you, Mr. Bersero, Mr. Lhashimi, Mrs. Bounemra, Mr. Sijilmasi. Thank you for accepting our invitation, and it would be our pleasure to welcome you in other webinars. Thank you, and have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye,
Shukran.
everyone. Keep safe.
Keep safe.